Welcome to the fourth and final lecture in our series, the Second Temple Period in Rabbinic Eyes. And today's lecture is entitled, Fashioning a Foundation Myth for the Rabbinic Movement. Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai is a friend of the emperor. Right? And today's lecture takes us to the end of the Second Temple Period, to the time of the siege in Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. Now, after the destruction of the temple, Second Temple, in the year 70 CE, the capital of the rabbinic movement appears in the city of Yavneh. Now, when the temple was destroyed, when Jerusalem was burned to the ground, and its inhabitants were either killed or they fled or they were taken captive, Jerusalem no longer serves as a spiritual or capital, a spiritual center or capital for the Jewish people. And when we move to rabbinic literature and Tannaitic sources, the earliest layer of rabbinic literature, right, we see that Tannaitic literature mentions in passing that after the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem, the Torah center, the spiritual capital for the rabbinic movement, appears in Yavneh, more precisely in a kerem b'Yavneh, in a vineyard at Yavneh. Right? So, in lieu of the traditional Jewish capital, Jerusalem, which had been destroyed by the Romans, Yavneh became the spiritual center for the rabbinic movement in the late first century. And Yavneh, the city, and Yavneh, the movement, comes to signify the spiritual emergence of the world of the rabbis after the Second Temple period. Okay? In those early layers of rabbinic literature, the rabbis do not explain how the rabbis selected Yavneh or came to Yavneh. The sources simply mention in passing Yavneh. So, for example, you'll hear in Tosefta Eduyot, when the sages entered the vineyard at Yavneh, they said. But how did they get there? Why Dafka Yavneh is not discussed. So Tannaitic literature never discusses the founding of the rabbinic center at Yavneh. Okay? One can learn from Tannaitic literature, the spiritual center prior to the destruction of the temple was in Jerusalem, right, around the temple. And the spiritual center afterwards, for the rabbis, was in Yavneh. The central Beit Midrash, or Beit Vad, of the rabbinic movement in the years following the destruction of the Second Temple was in Yavneh. But Tannaitic literature does not describe when or how the transition from Jerusalem to Yavneh took place. Now, what is absent from Tannaitic literature is filled in later Amoraic literature. Okay? This implied transition from Jerusalem to Yavneh is furnished with an explicit and detailed narrative in Amoraic literature, which describes how a leading rabbi of the late Second Temple period, Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai, he left Jerusalem for Yavneh during the siege on Jerusalem in order to restore Judaism for the period after the destruction of the temple, which he foresaw. Okay? And in time, the story of the founding of Yavneh will become a fundamental feature of the historical narrative told about the restoration and rebirth of the Jewish people after the destruction of the Second Temple. Okay. Now, the story of Yohanan ben Zakkai's escape from Jerusalem and transition to Yavneh appears in four different versions in Amoraic literature. It appears in Avot Rabbi Natan Bet, the 6th chapter, in Avot Rabbi Natan Aleph, the 4th chapter, in Bavli Gitin, and in Eicha Rabati. Okay? And we don't have time today to explore all the differences between these various versions, so we're going to focus on what I believe to be the earliest version of these four versions. Doesn't make it necessarily very early objectively. It's relatively early compared to the others. It is still a late Amoraic text. And so we're going to focus on Avot Rabbi Natan Bet, Avot Rabbi Natan B, as you'll see here. And it doesn't mean that there aren't earlier elements also preserved, perhaps in Eicha Rabati, but for the sake of this lecture, we will focus on Avot Rabbi Natan B. Okay. And we'll read the story, and after we read the story, we'll relate to various elements of the story which have occupied historians as well as the public for many generations. So let's get started. 1. Okay? And I separated the story, or divided the story, into 5 parts, which are the 5, I think, basic elements of the story, which we'll come to after we also finish the story to sum it up. Now, when Vespasian came and besieged Jerusalem, according to Josephus, the siege of Jerusalem began in the spring of the year 70. Okay? So, when Vespasian came and besieged Jerusalem, he encamped opposite the wall of Jerusalem and said to the men of Jerusalem, "Break one bow and one arrow, and I will leave you in peace." What does Vespasian want? Vespasian wants to leave. He doesn't want to stick around anymore, right? So he says, break a bow and an arrow, a symbolic gesture, which essentially translates to surrender. Surrender and I'll leave. I don't want to fight anymore. I don't want to destroy the city. I want to leave, okay? So he said this to them once and then a second time, but they did not accept, right? So the Jewish rebels in Jerusalem do not accept Vespasian's offer to simply surrender, and he will leave. Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai said to them, "You will be the cause of this city being destroyed and this temple being burned." Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai opposes the rebels, and he says, this is our opportunity now. We should take the offer, make the symbolic gesture, surrender, and then the city won't be destroyed. The temple won't be burned down. But if you're not accepting it, you are going to be the cause of this city being destroyed. How does he say it here? The city being destroyed and this temple being burned. They said to him, despite his advice to take the offer, "As we sallied forth against the previous commanders and slaughtered them, so will we sally forth against this one and kill him." Right? We've had successes against 2 previous Roman commanders, and this seems to be an echo of something Josephus tells us about Jewish victories against two previous victories against 2 Roman commanders. So the rebels are saying here, we were successful in the past, we will be successful against Vespasian as well. Okay. Our story continues. So after we heard how Yohanan ben Zakkai opposes the war and foresees its destruction, what happens? Everything that Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai said to them, right? Yohanan ben Zakkai is opposing the continued rebellion. They, i.e. collaborators with Rome, okay, wrote into documents which they attached to arrows and shot outside the wall reporting, "Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai is a friend of the emperor." Okay. Now, we had it here in these parentheses, collaborators with Rome. It's not exactly clear who is sending these messages. Okay. In other manuscripts of Avot Rabbi Natan B, there are good indications that it seems to be they're referring to Jewish people in the city. So in Parma, there's an addition here which says there were good men there who would write. They would write these messages. Munich calls them also righteous good men, which then would seem to indicate we're dealing with people in the city, which seems to be what the text is saying. People in the city, Jews in the city, who know of Yohanan ben Zakkai's attempts to stop the revolt. And they shoot these messages out on arrows to the Romans besieging the city, telling them Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai is a friend of the emperor. Avot Rabbi Natan A writes, Vespasian had men encamped opposite the walls of Jerusalem, and everything which they heard they would write, so that has it as Roman spies. Avot Rabbi Natan A has a different take on the story, but I'm not sure that that's really appropriate for this version of the story. In any event, we have messages being sent by arrow from within the city, from the besieged to the besiegers outside the city, telling the Romans Yohanan ben Zakkai supports them. Okay. That was our second element in the story, the arrows. 3, next part of the story. When Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai saw that the people were not willing to listen to him, he said to his disciples, "Comrades, stand up and take me out of here." All right? The people aren't listening to me. The rebels are continuing the revolt. I need to find a way to deal with this without depending anymore on the rebels. I need a different solution. So he decides, I must leave the city. They put him in a wooden coffin. Rabbi Eliezer took the head, and Rabbi Joshua and Rabbi Judah the feet. They kept making their way until they reached the city's gateway. So now they are taking Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai in the coffin, pretending that he is dead, right? And they're going to go outside the city to bury him outside the city. And this way he can escape from the city. When they reached the city's gateway, they, the disciples, said to them, the gatekeepers, now these are Jewish gatekeepers, part of the rebels, open up for us so that we can go out and bury him. Right? We need to bury him. Dead man. They, the gatekeepers, said to them, the disciples, we will not open until we first stab him with a sword. Oh, we have no problems with you going out to bury a corpse. Let's just make sure it's a corpse. The disciples replied, you will be the cause of the spreading of an evil report about your city. Tomorrow people will say they even stabbed Rabban Yohanan. Oh, how dare you stab such an esteemed figure like Yohanan ben Zakkai? You're going to spread evil rumors about the Jews, about the people in the city, that they stabbed Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai's corpse, defiled his corpse. Finally, the guards stood and opened for them. The coffin escape works, the strategy works, and the gatekeepers let Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai's disciples carry him out of the city in a coffin. So after the arrows, we had the story about the coffin escape. Our story continues. When Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai exited the gate of Jerusalem, he went and asked after the well-being of Vespasian, the way one asks after the peace or the well-being of an emperor. He sent to him, long live my lord the emperor. Usually the different versions of the story have some, they usually messed up here a little bit, because presumably they were trying to do some sort of transliteration of a phrase in Latin, which may well have been, vive domine imperator, long live the emperor. Okay? So Yohanan ben Zakkai is now out of the city. He comes and meets the head of the besieging army, Vespasian, who is, we'll see, is a general, and he says to him, long live the emperor. Vespasian asked him, are you Ben Zakkai? Right? He answered yes. Now, Vespasian has heard of Ben Zakkai, and makes sense because we heard about the arrows. Presumably he knows of Yohanan ben Zakkai, at least from the arrow story, which told him, oh, Ben Zakkai supports you. Vespasian said, you have cornered me. Or alternatively, you have, another version, you have killed me. What's the problem here? Why has he cornered Vespasian? Because on the one hand, Vespasian, though, he's a friend. He's been pursuing peace. He's on Vespasian's side here. But on the other hand, the moment Yohanan ben Zakkai refers to Vespasian as an emperor, that is a rebellious act. Because there is an emperor. And if you call a general an emperor when there is an emperor, you're essentially rebelling against the Roman emperor. So he's certainly not only endangering his own life, he's endangering Vespasian's life if Vespasian lets this happen. Right? It's Vespasian as if saying, I'm the emperor. So that's how Yohanan ben Zakkai has cornered him. Or in another version, when he's killed him, is because if word gets back to Rome that Vespasian is pretending to be emperor, or Vespasian views himself as emperor, Vespasian will be put to death. Yohanan answered, fear not, it is written in our scripture that this temple will be destroyed only by a king, as scripture says, and Lebanon shall fall by a mighty one. Right? So, no worries, Yohanan ben Zakkai says. What he gives here is basically a drasha. He's giving an interpretation of a biblical passage, but in essence it's a prophecy. And this prophecy is, no worries, Vespasian, you will be emperor. Okay, and so we have here this prophecy. Yohanan ben Zakkai has come out, he meets Vespasian, and he tells Vespasian, although you're not emperor yet, you will be emperor. Okay? The logic here being, of course, as they study the pasuk, that the mighty one who will destroy Lebanon, in this case meaning the temple, the mighty one must be a king or the emperor, the Roman emperor. Okay. So he, Yohanan ben Zakkai, was put in the custody of two officers. So now even though the arrow messages were sent which said Yohanan ben Zakkai is a friend of the king, and even though Yohanan ben Zakkai just gave a prophecy that Vespasian will be emperor, despite all that, he's still being kept under guard. Okay? They don't fully trust him. Here. And now we have the conclusion of our story. In 3 days, letters came to Vespasian from Rome saying, Nero the emperor died, and the Romans have enthroned you. Right? Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai's prophecy has been fulfilled. So he sent a messenger and summoned Rabban Yohanan and said, ask me a favor. Now finally that the prophecy has been fulfilled, Vespasian trusts fully Yohanan ben Zakkai. So Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai replied, I ask of you Yavneh, where I may study Torah and carry out the law of tzitzit, fringes, and keep all the other commandments. Okay? More famous version of this request is the Babylonian Talmud's version, where it says, give me Yavneh and its sages. This is the version that we have here in Avot Rabbi Natan. So Yohanan ben Zakkai asks that he can move to Yavneh. Here, the foundation of the rabbinic movement at Yavneh. I'd like to go to Yavneh, where I may study Torah and carry out the other commandments, the other mitzvot. And Vespasian said to him, here it is yours as a gift. Yavneh is all yours. Go ahead, move to Yavneh. And thus we have an Amoraic story telling us of the foundation of the study house, Yohanan ben Zakkai's Beit Midrash, Beit Vad, in Yavneh, or more broadly, what will be viewed as the establishment of the rabbinic movement in Yavneh. Okay? So we have the escape from Jerusalem, the prophecy of Vespasian becoming emperor, and then once he becomes emperor, Yohanan ben Zakkai receiving Yavneh as a wonderful gift. Okay? And if we repeat what were the 5 basic elements of the story, to which we'll return again later on, Yohanan ben Zakkai first opposed the revolt, and he foresaw the destruction of the temple, and that's why he supports Vespasian's offer to surrender. We have the arrow messages delivered to the Romans, which reveal that Yohanan ben Zakkai in the city supports them. Number 3, that was the first 2. 3, we have Yohanan ben Zakkai fleeing Jerusalem in a coffin. 4, we have Yohanan ben Zakkai's prophecy that Vespasian will become emperor. And 5, we have Yohanan ben Zakkai moving from Jerusalem to Yavneh. Okay? And as I said, we'll return to these elements shortly. Now, traditionally, scholars have argued that the story, this important story, reveals, I'll summarize and say, 3 features of the past. One factual, one didactic, and one in a long-term historical point. Okay? And let's go over each one. The factual issue. Okay? It was assumed that the story is based on a historical kernel, and the traditional historical approach to sage stories, which I think has become clear in this series that there are serious problems with this approach, and we now have a different approach. But the traditional approach was that sage stories, we presume that they are based on historical kernels, even if we have no other supporting evidence. Historians peel away the literary elements, the different elements that are problematic. If they have any local or immediate reasons to doubt the elements, they doubt them in order to reconstruct what actually happened. So in our case, scholars imagine that this story preserves an actual conversation or an actual interaction between Yohanan ben Zakkai and a Roman leader during the siege of Jerusalem. And then we'll see that different exactly takes on all the historical elements in the story. But Yohanan ben Zakkai is eventually granted, either he's granted Yavneh or he's granted a certain measure of religious freedom in Yavneh. Okay, so those are the factual elements at the heart of the story. That's been one theme in historical writing about our story. A second point is a didactic feature. Yohanan ben Zakkai was a Jewish hero who risked his life when he exited Jerusalem in order to save Judaism. And that's why he leaves the city. He leaves the city to save Judaism. And the third point is the long-term historical point, which is that the overarching message of our story is that while the Jews lose the Great Revolt, right, they're going to lose this war, okay? But the long-term cultural, one might even say existential conflict between the Jewish tradition, the Jewish way of life, and Roman culture, that clash between civilizations, that the Jews won through Yavneh. Right? So the Romans will win the war, but in granting the Jews Yavneh, they will lose the ultimate cultural clash of civilizations. Okay. So we're going to focus now. We're going to turn to a great 19th century historian, Heinrich Gretz, to see these elements in his writings. And then we'll take a peek in two 20th century historians, in Gedaliahu Alon and Shmuel Safrai, to see how they echo these elements, updating it and changing a bit, but they still echo these elements in Gretz's analysis. And let's open with Gretz. Okay. During the stormy days of the revolution, this is Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai, owing to his peaceful character, joined the party of peace. And on several occasions, he urged the nation and the zealots to surrender the town of Jerusalem and submit to the Romans. Why do you desire to destroy the town and to give up the temple to the flames? He would say to the leaders of the revolution. Notwithstanding the respect in which he was held, his well-meant admonitions were ignored by the zealots. Right? The spies whom the Roman general placed in the besieged city of Jerusalem, right? Now they are Roman spies in the city in his reading, okay? Perhaps based on Avot Rabbi Natan A here, and who reported to him what took place, did not fail to announce that Yohanan belonged to the friends of Rome and that he counseled the chiefs to make peace. Meanwhile, this is a very similar story to what we read in Avot Rabbi Natan. The news from the town was conveyed on small pieces of paper. Here we have the arrow element, which were shot on arrows into the Roman camp, induced either by fear of the zealots or by the desire of obtaining a place of safety for the law. Yohanan formed the idea of taking refuge in the camp of Titus. To depart from the town was, however, very difficult, as the zealots kept up a constant watch. Yohanan, therefore, aided by a leader of the zealots named Ben Batiach. Now, we didn't see that name. That name comes from Echarabati, a different version of our story. So, aided by Ben Batiach, he determined to have himself conveyed out of the town as a corpse. Having been placed in the coffin, he was carried out of the city gates at the hour of sunset by his pupils Eleazar and Joshua. Titus received the fugitive in a friendly manner and gave him permission to make some request of him. So, two very important differences between what we read and what we just encountered in Gretz, which we have to unpack a bit. First of all, who does Yohanan ben Zakkai meet? In Gretz's account, he meets Titus, not Vespasian. Right? In all the rabbinic versions, he meets Vespasian. Right? But Gretz has to meet Titus. And Gretz also explains in the footnote why he has to meet Titus and why it's not Vespasian. And the problem is that Gretz has a historical or chronological problem here. Okay? The news that Nero died, right, which comes in our story, that news, as we know from other historical sources, reached Judea in June of 68. Okay? Vespasian became emperor in July of 69, after the year of the four emperors, after Nero died. There was civil war in Rome, there are problems, not our issue now, but eventually in July of 69, Vespasian becomes emperor. He leaves Judea and goes to Egypt. When Vespasian leaves, his son, the general Titus, continues the war in Judea and eventually erects the siege on Jerusalem in the spring of 70. So the Roman general in charge of the siege was not Vespasian, it was Titus. Okay? This comes across very clearly in Josephus' account of the war. Okay? So, one, he has to change Vespasian to Titus, because he has a chronological problem. It can't be Vespasian. Oh, the rabbis must have meant Titus. Now the problem with Titus is there's no sense in the prophecy. And if you'll just note, that's a second difference here. Gretz leaves out the prophecy. Why does he leave out the prophecy? Because he has to leave out the prophecy once he's moved the story from Vespasian to Titus. The prophecy makes sense with Vespasian, because Vespasian was what was called a novus homo. He was a new man. He wasn't part of the traditional, certainly not part of the emperor's imperial family, but he really wasn't even the part of the aristocracy in Rome. And after there were other attempts, other people during this past year of 69 tried to become emperor. In the end, Vespasian becomes emperor, and he's the one who will actually stay emperor. Okay? The prophecy makes sense for Vespasian, for a new man to all of a sudden become, of course, he was an important general in the Roman army, but he now becomes emperor. That is something not entirely expected. And one has a prophecy and says, Vespasian will be emperor. Eventually, in truth, Titus will also become emperor, but there will be nothing surprising about Titus becoming emperor because he's simply going to inherit the job from his father. And of course, he's not going to inherit it now. When any news comes in about Nero, that's actually Vespasian who will become emperor then. So once Gretz replaces Vespasian with Titus because of the historical problems here, now he has to omit the prophecy, which no longer works. And that's what he does. Let's continue in his account. Okay? Yohanan modestly requested that he might be permitted to establish a school at Yavneh where he could give lectures to his pupils. Okay? So now Yohanan ben Zakkai is given his request by Titus, not because of the prophecy, because there was no prophecy, perhaps because of the arrows, which showed that he was supporting the Romans already in the city. And then he gives him Yavneh. Now, the interesting phrase that Gretz uses here, he modestly requested that he might be permitted. Now, how does Gretz know this is simply a modest request? Well, we'll just jump ahead a little bit. This he learns not from our version of the story, which gave no hint that this was a modest request. This comes from the Babylonian Talmud. And if we just see here quickly, Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai said to his disciples, devise some plan for me to escape. Perhaps I shall be able to save a little. Okay? And then Vespasian said, you can, however, make a request of me, and I will grant it. He said to him, give me Yavneh and its sages, and the family chain of Rabban Gamliel, and the physicians to heal Rabbi Tzadok. Now is the point that's important for us. Rav Yosef, and some say Rabbi Akiva, applied to him the verse, God turns wise men backward and makes their knowledge foolish. He ought to have said to him, this is what Yohanan ben Zakkai should have said, let the Jews off this time. Go away. Give up your siege. He, however, thought that so much he would not grant, and so even the little would not be saved. Since Yohanan ben Zakkai was afraid if he asked for something so big, that would be rejected, and then he wouldn't even get a small request granted, so he went with a more minor and modest request. This logic here that we're finding in the Babylonian Talmud is typical of the rabbinic idea of tafasta meruba lo tafasta. If you ask for too much, you might not get it, so ask for something or try for something more moderate, and that's the way Gretz reads what happened in our story here, combining the Babylonian Talmud's version of our story. One of the reasons I mentioned this, that he's trying to show how he's using different versions of the story, because Gretz is actually treating each version of our story as an independent witness to the story, and a good historical testimony. So he's taking what he thinks is historical from each element and putting them together, and thus trying to reconstruct the original version of the story, meaning the original version of the event, what actually happened. Okay, and now let's conclude Gretz's analysis. The district in which this town lay belonged to the private domains of the imperial house, to which it had been bequeathed by the last will of Shalom, the sister of Herod. Right? That's in Yavneh. Okay? And here we have his final line for our purposes. Titus had nothing to urge against the harmless wish of Yohanan, for he could not foresee that by this unimportant concession, he was enabling Judaism, feeble as it then appeared, to outlive Rome, which was in all its vigor by thousands of years. Had Titus understood what he was granting to Yohanan ben Zakkai, he wouldn't have granted him Yavneh. If he foresaw that this would be the future of Judaism, he wouldn't have done it. Because, in Gretz's mind, our story is about the clash of cultures between Judaism and Rome. And Titus would not have wanted the Jews to survive and Jewish culture, Jewish religion to survive long after the Roman Empire will fall. So this is Gretz's reading here, that although in the short term, the Jews do lose the Great Revolt, in the long term, via Yavneh, Jewish culture and religion will succeed, and we have victory over the Roman attempt to wipe out Judaism. And that seems to be the way Gretz is interpreting our story. Let's jump to Safrai, okay, who echoes this position. Okay. Let me just find it here. Did I go a little too far? I'm sorry. Here we go for Safrai. Rome, just going to read the bolded section here. Rome would hardly have given permission to establish a national center, even if only a spiritual one, in Yavneh. Rome would never have agreed to this. This is not what Rome would have agreed to. Safrai here is following also Gedaliahu alone, who thinks not only would Rome have agreed to grant Yochanan ben Zakkai a national home, or a spiritual home even for the Jewish people, a new center, a new Torah center, but he actually didn't. And Gedaliahu alone's reading here, which we can see a bit here, in light of the facts elucidated above, that it was the Roman practice to exile the fugitives and settle them in internment camps, either in Eretz Israel or in foreign parts, and two, that the Romans intended to suppress the nation in every possible way, we must include Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai and his company went to Yavneh, not because they particularly desired this place, but because they were sent there against their will, like many illustrious fugitives, since Yavneh served as one of the places of exile. Okay? And we continue a little further in his writing. For Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai could not hope to receive at that time any benefit for the general public. Okay? Safrai and Alon here, they echo Gretz's idea that there's no way the Romans would have granted Yavneh had they knew what was going to happen, and Alon takes it even a step further and says, and they didn't grant Yavneh. Here he thinks there's a historical kernel of the story, but it's not that Vespasian or Titus granted Yochanan ben Zakkai Yavneh. It's that Yochanan ben Zakkai was sent to Yavneh against his will as a prisoner of war, and this was an internment camp. But the historical element is he did ask for certain religious freedoms, which he was granted there. So we see this shared interpretation of our story, which setting aside the question of how much or how many historical kernels can we take out of the story, but there is a certain element, say perhaps more of the story or less of the story is historical. Do we have to omit just the prophecy, which seems to be Gretz's take? Maybe we have to say, well, he didn't actually grant it to him. Yochanan ben Zakkai was sent there, but he was granted religious freedoms. So there's a dispute here on how much of the story is historical, but the overarching interpretation seems to be roughly the same, which is in the long-term clash, Judaism wins out here. And had the Romans understood what Yavneh would mean, they wouldn't have granted Yavneh or wouldn't have allowed those religious freedoms at Yavneh. Now, I just want to offer a different, focusing on the story reread in Avot Rabbi Natan B. I think actually the message of the story is quite different if we just read the story. In the story, the problematic element is not the Romans, and Vespasian is not the problematic element. Vespasian and Yochanan ben Zakkai are in agreement that the time has come for the Jews to surrender. Okay? The problematic element are the Jewish extremists who refuse to make a symbolic gesture and surrender to the Romans. So I would argue, based on the story reread, that the story is really not about cultural victory or supremacy, but it's rather about a way to cooperate with the Gentile powers so that Jews can continue practicing Judaism. Right? And it's okay to cooperate with Vespasian and the Romans, so long, of course, as they grant you Yavneh and they give you the freedoms to keep the commandments in Yavneh. Okay. In terms of the factual elements of the story, so we mentioned the previous approach, right, traditional historical approach to these stories, which assumes that there's a historical kernel, unless one has local and immediate reasons to doubt it. Nowadays, scholarship has changed on this topic quite severely, often due to the chronological gap, often between the time of the events and the time of our sources. Our sources are often edited centuries later, many centuries later at times, right? In our case, we have no Tannaitic, we have no early rabbinic sources about our story. They're only much later. And scholars came to realize, and this in and of itself is a very long story, which I won't go into now. It's a story of the development of scholarship, but that rabbinic sage stories are not simply, or not historical kernels dressed up, but rather the genre is different. And there are different names of the genre. Some people view it as dramatic narrative or didactic fiction, but these stories aren't even necessarily built on historical kernels. They might be, and in some cases, when we have good evidence outside, we can actually corroborate what they tell us. But in many cases, they may not even be well based on historical evidence because they're not based on historical kernels, but they might be developing literary kernels for different didactic, educational, or ideological purposes. Okay? What this approach has allowed scholars to do, when scholars understood that it may well be that a story we're analyzing isn't based simply, it's not simply recording what happened. It allowed us to say, well, maybe we can find literary sources that underlie the text. Not simply presuppose and assume, oh, there was an event here, even though we have no other evidence for this event, but if we actually have sources, maybe we can say, perhaps these sources underlie our story. So now I want to return to the 5 elements that we mentioned previously. That Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai opposed the revolt, foreseeing its danger to the temple, the arrow messages, the flight from besieged Jerusalem in the coffin, the prophecy that Vespasian would be emperor, and the transition to Yavneh. And we'll start with the first element. Here we are. We're reading from Mechilta Yitro, a Tannaitic source, earlier than any version we have of our story. And in this story, in this text, Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai said, behold, it says, you must build the altar of the Lord your God of unhewn stones. They are to be stones that establish peace. Now, by using the method of kal v'chomer, you reason. The stones for the altar do not see, nor hear, nor speak. Yet because they serve to establish peace between Israel and their Father in heaven, the Holy One, blessed be He, said, do not wield an iron tool over them. How much the more then should He who establishes peace between man and his fellow man, between husband and wife, between city and city, between nation and nation, between family and family, between government and government, be protected so that no harm should come to him. Okay? This source does not explicitly relate to the Great Revolt, but it does portray Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai as someone who desires peace between city and city, between nation and nation, between government and government. You could see how a source like this would inspire people to think of Yohanan ben Zakkai as a man of the peace camp. Let us move on to our next source. Here we are in the Palestinian Talmud, right? Yerushalmi Yoma. Also, this is an Amoraic text, but Yerushalmi also edited before any of our versions of our story. It was taught in the Breita 40 years prior to the destruction of the temple. The westernmost lamp was extinguished. The crimson thread remained crimson. The lot for the Lord came up in the left hand. And they would close the temple doors by night. This is important for us. At night, they would close the temple doors and get up in the morning and find them open. The doors would be open. They would have opened by themselves. Said to the temple, Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai, O temple, why do you frighten us? We know that you will end up destroyed, for it has been said, throw open your gates, O Lebanon, and let the fire consume your cedars. Yohanan ben Zakkai here calls out or reprimands or talks to the temple, and when it opens its doors, he says, why are you frightening us? We know that you will be destroyed. So in these sources, we have here a portrait of Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai, of someone who both is in favor of peace between government and government, between nation and nation, and he foresees the destruction of the temple sometime before. Okay. So our first element was Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai sort of being in the peace camp and foreseeing the destruction, telling the rebels, "Ooh, you're going to cause the city to be destroyed." And here we have in earlier sources, not exactly that idea, but we can see what might be the kernels of that idea. Now we move to Vayikra Rabbah, another Amoraic text, also early Amoraic. Rabbi Brechia said in the name of Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana, what had Shevna and Yoach done? Characters from the First Temple period, and we are here talking about the siege of Sancheriv on Jerusalem from biblical times. They wrote a missive, stuck it on an arrow, and dispatched it through a window to Sancheriv, and on it was written, "We and all the children of Jerusalem seek to make peace with you, but Chizkiyahu and Yeshayahu do not seek to make peace with you." Here, in an earlier work, this is earlier than any version of our story, right? We have here the arrow element in an earlier siege, right? Here we have messengers from in the city of Jerusalem, right, sending to the besieging enemies outside messages on an arrow telling them who support them and who oppose them within the city. This is precisely the arrow element which is incorporated into our story. Here it appears in reference to First Temple times, but here it appears in an earlier source. Okay. The escape from Jerusalem in the coffin. Here let's turn to Josephus in his book of Jewish Antiquities, book 15. And so for the time being, Herod seemed to have healed his domestic troubles. But still he did not long remain free of suspicion, as is natural after a reconciliation, for he had reason to fear from Alexandra's past attempts, Alexandra is his mother-in-law, that she would try to overthrow his government if she found an opportunity. He therefore ordered her to remain in her palace in Jerusalem and not do anything on her own authority. And as a careful watch was kept, nothing escaped him, not even what she did in her daily life. All this gradually made her wild with rage and caused hatred to grow in addition, for she had a full share of womanly pride and resented the supervision that came from his suspicion, and she thought anything was better than to be deprived of her freedom, right? A freedom of action, and to live the rest of her life in slavery, in spite of appearing to have honor. She therefore wrote to Cleopatra, making a long sustained lament about the state in which she found herself. Right? So Alexandra, Herod's mother-in-law, besieged in her own palace in Jerusalem, she can't leave. So what? She's looking for help. What should I do? And urging her, so she turns to her friend Cleopatra, and urging her to give her as much help as she possibly could. Thereupon Cleopatra told her to escape secretly with her son and come to her in Egypt. This seemed to Alexandra a good idea, and she contrived the following scheme. She had 2 coffins made as if for the transporting of dead bodies, and placed herself and her son in them, after giving orders to those of her servants who knew of the plan to take them away during the night. Okay? The rest of the story is not so important for us now. They end up getting detected. But once we have here, also in Jerusalem, a plan to leave the city. When someone is besieged, she cannot leave. She's being imprisoned in the city, and she leaves with her son pretending to be dead in coffins. This trick, as it were, of leaving a city when you're enclosed in the city in a coffin, there are other examples of this trick in Greek and Latin literature. And just take a look at what happens in Plutarch. Plutarch tells another case where this happens. Nicocrates, having made himself despot over the people of Cyrene, not only ordered the murder of many persons, but killed with his own hand Melanopus, the priest of Apollo, and took the priesthood himself. And now here's important for us. In addition to his other unnumbered acts of lawlessness, he stationed guards at the gates who maltreated the dead that were being borne to the grave, prodding them with daggers and applying red-hot irons to them so that none of the citizens should be secretly carried out in the guise of a corpse. And just like Nicocrates here, the Jews in our story hope to ensure that no one escapes the city, that Yohanan ben Zakkai in the coffin doesn't escape the city by pretending to be a corpse, and they want to stab the body. So not only do we have, already in Josephus, we have this attempt to leave Jerusalem, a besieged Jerusalem. Here we have elsewhere even the idea that they will stab the corpse. Now let's talk about the prophecy. Okay? Yohanan ben Zakkai's prophecy to Vespasian, well, Josephus does something very similar. And let's see what happens in Josephus. And let's recall, Josephus writes this about himself, and he's writing this in the 1st century. Vespasian, however, ordered him to be guarded with every precaution. Once Josephus is captured, he surrenders to the Romans. So he's being protected, he's being guarded. Okay? Vespasian captured him, intending shortly to send him to Nero. On hearing this, Josephus expressed the desire for a private interview with him, Vespasian having ordered all to withdraw except his son Titus and 2 of his friends. So Josephus asks for a private interview, essentially because he understands that this is a dangerous thing he's about to say, a familiar idea to us. The prisoner thus addressed him, "You imagine, Vespasian, that in the person of Josephus you have taken a mere captive, but I come to you as a messenger of greater destinies. Had I not been sent on this errand by God, I knew the law of the Jews and how it becomes a general to die. To Nero do you send me? Why then, think you that Nero and those who before your accession succeed him will continue? You will be Caesar, Vespasian. You will be emperor, you and your son here. Bind me then yet more securely in chains." Right? Even after the prophecy, he's saying, bind me in chains, keep me guarded. Just like Yohanan ben Zakkai we saw, they keep him guarded after the prophecy. "And keep me for yourself, for you, Caesar, are master, not of me only, but of land and sea and the whole human race. For myself, I ask to be punished by stricter custody if I have dared to trifle with the words of God." Right? Josephus here prophesizes, Vespasian, you will be emperor. To this speech, Vespasian at the moment seemed to attach little credit, supposing it to be a trick of Josephus to save his life. Gradually, however, he was led to believe it, for God was already rousing in him thoughts of empire and by other tokens of foreshadowing the throne. While he did not release Josephus from his custody or chains, he presented him with raiment and other precious gifts and continued to treat him with kindness and solicitude, being warmly supported by Titus in these courtesies. Wow, like Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai, but here in a much earlier source, we have the prophecy that Vespasian will be king. We have the fear that the prophecy is dangerous. You cornered me, right? So Josephus avoids that by having a private session with Vespasian. And then, after the prophecy, the guards continue to watch over him. But most importantly now, we understand why Vespasian is in this story. Okay? When Josephus tells the story, it takes place in the north, in Yotfat, in the year 67, after Josephus surrenders. And there, the general in charge is Vespasian, and this is prior to Nero's death. There, the story of the prophecy to the emperor makes sense. It didn't make sense, it doesn't make sense, with Yohanan ben Zakkai in Jerusalem in the year 70. And this is what often happens when we have a secondary context for an element, for a motif, when it moves from one place to another. Sometimes it works perfectly in the original place, right? Josephus' story makes perfect sense when he tells Vespasian, you will be king. It does not make sense in the siege of Jerusalem for Yohanan ben Zakkai in the year 70, when Vespasian is already emperor and his son Titus is in charge of the siege. Now, it could well be that our rabbinic author who moved the element wasn't aware of the chronological difficulties or didn't care, but this type of infelicity is something quite common when an element moves from its original context to a secondary context. Also mentioned parenthetically in the context of Josephus, something we hinted to already in our first lecture, that just like in the story of Alexander the Great meeting the high priest, right? A priest goes out to meet a conquering foreign general, telling and the meeting of the priest with the foreign leader indicates that the foreign leader understands that he will be successful, and there we have the dream that Alexander had in Dium before the war. So here too, Josephus, a priest, meets Vespasian and also tells him, you will be successful, you will be emperor. Okay. Our final element in the story, which we can say rather quickly, is that Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai moves from Jerusalem to Yavneh, and in rabbinic literature, we need not read these stories here, these texts here, but rabbinic literature places Yohanan ben Zakkai in Jerusalem prior to the destruction of the temple, as you can see in this source, for example, and it places him in Yavneh after the war. Okay. So we've seen how the 5 central elements in our story, right, that Yohanan ben Zakkai was in favor of peace and foresaw the destruction, that the arrows are sent to let the enemies know that he is on their side, the coffin escape, the prophecy, and then the transition from Jerusalem to Yavneh. If you were familiar with rabbinic literature, and if you're familiar with different traditions, say the Josephian tradition about his own prophecy, you had the raw materials, the raw literary materials to tell your story. But why tell this story? This story is a dangerous story to tell. Right? The narrative arc of this story is potentially damning. Right? You're telling it. Why do I say that? Because Yohanan ben Zakkai, one could say he's escaping. When he escapes Jerusalem, he's fleeing. Perhaps he's fleeing the leadership. And there is a danger here that people might say he was a coward. And that's a danger. He was a traitor. He betrayed his people. Now, the story goes on, of course, to make sure he risked his life, right? But there's still a danger here. And when Josephus writes about himself, you can see in this source, people called Josephus, when they saw he was being treated well by the Romans, right? Some abused him as a coward, others as a traitor, reading at the end here, and throughout the city of Jerusalem, there was general indignation and curses were heaped upon his devoted head. Now, I think it's clear that in our case, Yohanan ben Zakkai is being viewed as a hero. But this is potentially a negative story to tell. Why risk telling this story? So I'd like to offer 2 entwined answers to this question. Even though we've had the different elements together in the story, we've tried to show you they were all literary elements which existed, why tell this story? Okay. The negative answer, so I have a negative and a positive answer. The negative answer is I don't think this story appeared right away, and indeed it doesn't appear in our sources for hundreds of years. And what I mean, though, is that in the nationalistic fervor of the 1st century and the 2nd century, when you have the Great Revolt, and then the Diaspora Revolt, and then the Bar Kokhba Revolt, I think it's unlikely people would have told this story in order to portray Yohanan ben Zakkai as a hero. I think it will take some time, perhaps a few centuries, for the nationalistic heat, fervor to die down before one could risk telling this story. Okay. That's sort of my negative answer, but now I want to entwine that with a positive answer. Our story is that of a Jewish leader in Jerusalem under siege. Now, he opposes the war. He foresees the destruction of the city, and therefore he calls upon his brethren to surrender. They do not agree to his request, and then the situation in the city deteriorates. When our leader recognizes that the end is near, okay, he tries to flee the city, but the Jewish guards of the city, cause him problems. In the long run, his peaceful stance serves him well, and because of it, the enemy leader will reward him. That story I just summarized, that plot line, that narrative arc, is not only the story of Yohanan ben Zakkai, that is the story of Yirmiyahu, as told in Yirmiyahu chapters 37 to 41. Of course, there are many differences between Yohanan ben Zakkai and Yirmiyahu, but that basic plot line I just outlined, that is the same. And what I think lies behind this story is that the rabbis who view the destruction of the Second Temple paradigmatically in light of the First Temple, and they often interpret the destruction of the Second Temple in light of the destruction of the First Temple, they are modeling Yohanan ben Zakkai's character in our story on the biblical image of Yirmiyahu. Truth is, Josephus himself at times portrays himself sort of as a new Yirmiyahu. But in this case, using the first temple as a paradigm for the second temple, the rabbis construct a story for Yohanan ben Zakkai, which makes him into the Yirmiyahu of Second Temple times. Now, Yirmiyahu was a link, as it were, between the first temple and the second temple. He prophesied that the temple would be rebuilt in another 70 years. And the rabbis believed that the prophecies of early Second Temple prophets, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, were already given to Yirmiyahu. In a similar vein, Yohanan ben Zakkai is ascribed various regulations in the wake of the destruction, like allowing a shofar to be blown on Shabbat or carrying a lulav out of Jerusalem, which encouraged one to see him as a link to a new world after the destruction of the temple. So Yirmiyahu, as a bridging figure who links the first temple to the second temple, is sort of the perfect model, the perfect paradigm for Yohanan ben Zakkai, who is now portrayed as the link between the Second Temple Judaism and the Rabbinic movement, Rabbinic Judaism, which flourishes in the wake of the destruction of the Second Temple. So if we return now to the different elements that historians have traditionally learned from the story, in terms of the factual element, should we postulate that our story preserves a historical kernel about a meeting between Yohanan ben Zakkai and a Roman general? I try to offer here a different view where we focus more on the literary kernels. In terms of the long-term historical clash of civilizations, it seems to me our story is more about, it's more against Jewish extremists rather than being about any long-term Jewish victory over Roman culture. In terms of the didactic message of the story, Yohanan ben Zakkai certainly is portrayed here as a hero, and Josephus' account of his own prophecy has been reworked here. But though inspired by Josephus, I tried to make the case here that the ultimate paradigm for Yohanan ben Zakkai here is actually Yirmiyahu, with our story painting Yohanan ben Zakkai in Yirmiyahu's biblical image as the Jewish leader in a time of tragedy and transition. Okay. To conclude with a final comment about this series as a whole, I've set forth in each one different arguments. Obviously, I find these arguments compelling, otherwise I wouldn't be arguing them. Some of you, I hope many of you, also find them compelling. Others perhaps will not find them compelling. For my part, whether you're convinced or not, I've tried to illustrate here in each lecture what is for many, and certainly outside of academic circles, an unfamiliar way of thinking about the formation of rabbinic stories. Thank you very much.